I'm Francesca Donnellan. Welcome to Becoming More Human, the podcast. Every generation, through its arts and creativity, explores the same questions. Who am I, and what really matters? We are so often taught how to emulate others, to make other people happy. But how do we access what's good for ourselves and be strong enough to actually claim it? It's a constant practice because we all keep evolving. There are no limits to personal growth. You can start your journey today and get closer to discovering your true self. Give back to the people around you and make the world a better place.
On today's episode, I'm talking with Claire, whose career spans over 2 decades in tech, creative agencies and people teams, which means she joins the dots between all these things to create powerful insights and deep realizations from leaders that creates lasting transformation. In 2019, she founded Image Beyond to help leaders from company founders to MDs, senior leaders and HR professionals think more creatively and to explore new possibilities with excitement. Claire's accolades include being voted as one of the Dot's top 100 rising stars, being chosen as one of Grant Thornton's faces of a vibrant economy, and is one of the Dot's Female Trailblazers nominees. In this episode, we discuss what an entrepreneur mindset is. Can it be taught, or are we born with it? We look at creativity and the importance of it in today's economy, and how creativity needs time. But as we get older, we often find the excuse to not have the time to play. This is an inspiring episode if you're feeling in need of a new perspective. So enough from me, and let's jump straight in.
Claire, a huge warm welcome to the podcast. We are so happy that you're joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm really good, thank you, Fran. I'm very excited to be here today.
Oh, well, it's an absolute pleasure. I would love you just to take a couple of minutes to introduce yourself to the listeners and let them know a bit more about who you are.
Thank you. So, hello, everyone. I'm Claire Koryczan, and I'm founder and director of Imagine Beyond, an organisation that I set up back in 2019 to really help leaders, founders and managers to think more creatively and explore new possibilities around growing business, but also managing people brilliantly. And before that, my 22-year career history combines a decade in the creative industries, right at the early part of my career, and then into the world of technology and innovation, where at the time I also trained to be a coach, and I've been using those skills ever since over the last decade. And then more recently, over the last 3 to 4 years, I've been much more focused in the people space. And what's been brilliant about that, Fran, is that all of my passion and my curiosity from way back when I was a teenager around understanding humanity, psychology, neuroscience, all of those things that have been the thread that have run consistent thread through all of those parts of my career have come to fruition over the last 3 to 4 years in all of the work that I do. And there was a real pivotal point early in my career when at the first agency I worked for, the leader, the managing director, a brilliant mind that I worked with, was very, very difficult to work for. And I remember thinking, I need to understand how I can, what I can do. I need to understand this mind. And I remember going to a bookshop and getting a book on understanding brilliant minds. And I would read that every single lunchtime.
Oh, my goodness.
And the reason that I share that story with you is because so much of the work that I do now, 20 odd years later, actually came from that original point, understanding brilliant minds and helping them to be brilliant with managing and leading people. And that self-awareness piece is that sort of thread that's run through all of it throughout my whole career. And that's the work that I do now. So that's a little bit of an intro in terms of who I am and what I do.
Well, thank you, Claire. I am really excited about this interview today because we all want to have a brilliant mind, don't we? Isn't that, we all want to work at our optimal. We all want to dive into that creative side of ourselves that so often we suppress as we get older. It changes as we get older. That creativity can often seem to disappear. Life gets serious. We, may have families. We might have children. We might have mortgages. We might have, a lot of life stuff on our shoulders. And creativity certainly isn't a word you often hear as you get older. It's certainly something
it feels very childlike and something that we encourage our children to be creative. So I'm so interested to understand your journey on how this started to unfold for you, and, you know, with all your different hats that you wear and the different jobs that you've done, and how that has shaped sort of where you are today. And I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
I grew up in a very creative household. My dad was always very creative. I played lots of musical instruments, toured around Europe when I was in high school as a solo clarinetist in the high school orchestra. And so that foundation has always been really cool, but in a very traditional sense of the word creative. And what I found over the years, having worked in the creative industry, when I stepped out of the industry into exploring what was going to be next, actually, that's when I became one of the most creative times in my entire career. And I've found that in the space, that is where we become our most resourceful. That is where we become our most innovative and our most creative. And that has really fed into a challenge that I set myself at the beginning of this year. So I freed up a little bit of time, and I set myself a challenge after feeling frustrated that I wanted to bring a product that could solve a problem to the world, that combined my entire career history, creativity, in technology and innovation, and people into a product that could solve a problem. And I sat down at the beginning of this year with a blank sheet of paper, and I would not let myself get up from the table that I was sitting at until I had figured out the start, the smallest of baby steps of what this product would be. And that's where the Entrepreneurial Leader program was born. It was born from looking at the challenges that are happening in business. So keeping people, developing people, a big variance between managers and leaders in terms of capabilities and styles, but also recognizing that the world that we live in now is constantly changing, and actually we need to be creative. We need to be imaginative. We need to come up with things that we've never experienced before, and navigate the business world with that lens in many ways. So I combined all of that into that program.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And so began the journey of the Entrepreneurial Leader program.
It's interesting that you've looked at the entrepreneurial journey in relation to creativity. Do you feel that the entrepreneurial journey really encompasses what creativity is and how it's harnessed its sort of power, and that type of person is more in tune with creativity, would you say?
I have seen and experienced in the leaders that I've worked with, in the networks that I'm part of, and my own experience, that an entrepreneurial mindset, it's not necessarily about coming up with a brand new business and about changing the world and doing all of those really big things that can feel quite overwhelming. An entrepreneurial mindset is really seeing the opportunity within the challenge. And when everyone else is running around thinking, oh, I don't know what I'm doing, actually the entrepreneurial mindset goes, okay, so what's the problem here and how can we solve it? And that for me is the epitome of creativity. That is the creative mind. That is where all those resources come to the forefront in terms of how you might solve a problem in a different way for people. So putting those two together, and having worked in very entrepreneurial businesses where creative problem solving is right at the very heart, I can see how that way of seeing the world and way of thinking, the mindset around that is so helpful in business now, because we're always navigating uncertainty. We're always navigating change, and there's always opportunity within the challenge around all of that. It's just about the way that you see the world.
It's an interesting mindset, isn't it, this entrepreneurial mindset? I've heard it mentioned quite a lot over the last few years, but prior to that, I hadn't really come across what that meant. Do you feel that an entrepreneur mindset is an exclusive club, or do you feel that anybody could have an entrepreneurial mindset?
My belief is that anyone can have it. As human beings, we are all born with the capacity to be creative, and creative not necessarily, creative can be in any sense of the word. It can be problem solving, it could be fine art, it could be so many different things. And we all have that capacity as human beings, and we all have the capacity to be curious as well. It's the fourth human drive. And so combining those two things together, and a range of other attributes as well, but I believe they're the two of the core fundamentals around an entrepreneurial mind.
And how do we start to tap into that? You know, if we're starting to feel frustrated with our current life and our current way of thinking and maybe our current career, how do we start to open that entrepreneurial mindset to look at our life differently and to see these wonderful opportunities?
Yeah, so the first thing is, when we feel frustrated about anything, that is usually a clue to something that we want to change in some way, shape or form. And if we look at that through the lens of career, when there is that tension, that frustration, it's usually a sign that our needs are being met. You know, we're not fulfilling our potential. We can feel that there is something more that we can give, that we can do. I know that that's exactly how I felt at the beginning of this year when I set myself that challenge. And so in that frustration, pay attention to it, because that's where the clues are in terms of, you know, what you need to do as a start point. And then from that, I would say, pay attention to what piques your interest, what you're finding that's interesting, fascinating, what you're drawn towards. One of the best pieces of advice I was ever given was stay in the emergence phase for as long as you can and pay attention to those things that you are drawn towards, because actually in that are the clues in terms of what's going to be important for you and where you might explore next. But it comes from curiosity and it links to creativity. But that frustration bit is really important, because that is telling you that something needs to change. There's something more, there's something different, there's something that can fulfill you and fill your heart more with joy.
Is there a process that you go through to kind of start that journey? Is there a strategy you need to take on, or is it quite simply pick up a book, do some Googling? How do you start to take action in that moment?
First of all, I would say baby steps. Start with the smallest thing. Go for a walk. Just give yourself space to be. And I find this really hard myself. I love reading, I love researching, I love doing things. I love the act of being in the process of doing things. But actually it's in that space where the beginning of that exploration comes. And so give yourself a little bit of space to start, and also just say to yourself, this is about baby steps. What is the smallest action or the smallest thing that I can do that can move me slightly towards where I want to go? And I would say start there, because often, and I know that I felt this myself, you can have this massive ambition. I want to do this. I've got this real sense of purpose and drive to change the world in this direction, and that is right up here, and you're right down here in terms of the gap, and that can feel hugely overwhelming. You've got that desire, you know that there is something that you want to do, and you've got that vision, but bridging that gap is really, really hard. And actually again, another fantastic piece of advice I was given is the baby steps part. What is the minimum viable action that you can do that can move you one step towards? Because you keep taking those actions, small steps, and over time they will compound. And when you look back, that'll be a huge leap. It really will.
Do you think in the day and age that we're living in, we're too quick to jump to that point of success and to hit monetary goals, and actually we're forgetting how to do the work less and less? Or
yes, the world that we live in, how we are, our relationship with technology, you know, all of these things have meant that we've learned behaviors over the last decade, really last 15 years, let's say, since the birth of the iPhone in 2007, we've learned behaviors of instant gratification, instant dopamine hits, and it's all that instant thirst for wanting results quickly. And that has meant that, yes, we are ambitious and we're hungry and we're driven to do these things. But we're always impatient in terms of wanting them to come quicker than they actually are. But in life, there are cycles and there are rhythms. And so, there's always going to be highs, there's always going to be lows. And actually, there's a reason why things take longer than what you want them to, because there are really important lessons for you on that journey. And you don't know it at the time. And it's frustrating because there's an end result or there's something that you're working towards. But actually, when you look back, and it's only when you look back, can you connect those dots and see, actually, I know now why it was important for me to do it in that way, even though it's frustrating at the time. But use that frustration, use it as fuel to drive you forward. But take the pause, because in the pause, in the reflection, and actually throughout the years, when you take those pauses and look back, that's really, it can give you a lot of insight and actually show you how far you've come.
It's interesting, isn't it? I often compare it to that, liken it of a singer, for instance. Adele, for want of a better example, it isn't in the spotlight year in, year out, day in, day out. She takes time. They all do. They have their moments where they're sort of rising up, launching albums out into the world for a set period of time, and then they disappear for quite often a year or more. It's not a question of just not being on social media for a day. And I think it's a good thing to look at, because we can relate to singers, can't we? We can see what they do, but it's so often in our own life, especially if you're on the entrepreneurial journey, that you're constantly chasing something and never really having those fallow years where we just, we're not stopping, we're not giving up, we're just taking stock and realigning maybe, and spending that time to get creative in this instance.
Yes, and that thirst and that desire, it gives us momentum to move forward and do amazing things. So it's really important that we harness that. But you're absolutely right, Fran. Being able to take stock and actually just take a pause, even if it is for 10 minutes, where you write, what am I most proud of over the last 6 months? And then you look back and you go, wow, okay, I have actually achieved a lot. Because normally we're always on to the next thing, on to the next thing, on to the next thing, forward vision, all of those brilliant things. But in the reflection comes the insight, for sure.
What have you found working with adults around the subject of creativity? Have you seen any blocks to how our relationship with creativity? Do you see things coming up time and time again with how that sits with us?
Yes, and I hear stories a lot. Oh, I'm not very creative. I've never been creative. I hear that a lot in terms of a lens with which people often see themselves and the stories that they tell. But you dig deeper into that, and actually you will find that there is a whole range of different things that person is doing that is very creative, but they just haven't labeled it creative. So, for example, they might be brilliant at cooking and, throwing lots of different things in and mixing something up from nothing. And that is a very creative thing to do, but they might not see themselves as creative because their job isn't like the traditional word of creative. I hear it. Just yesterday, I was having a call with a lady that I'm working with, and she was saying, I never thought myself as creative. She's a writer and actually very creative now. Before, she was in product development, and actually the problem solving that's required in product development is massively creative, but she never saw herself as creative. So absolutely, I think it's because creativity, it's such a big word that covers so many different things. Our education system defines it in quite a narrow box, and so we grow up with the beliefs and the values around creativity in quite a narrow box, but actually the reality is that creativity is so many different things in so many different ways. And that's the magic of it.
How do we start to connect to that part of ourselves then? Because from research, it obviously has huge benefits to the way our brain works, the way we operate. It lifts our mood. It does a huge amount to us creativity. So
yes,
how can we start to connect into that? And what are sort of the benefits that you've seen in being able to connect to creativity?
So if I think about my own experience, there are a couple of things that really help me to connect to creativity. The first one is play, and actually just giving yourself permission to do something that you wouldn't normally do. So, for example, me and my 7-year-old son, when I take him to school in the morning, we do a fun little play, which is to find something unusual on our typical walk to school. So we are searching for unusual, the smallest, the most interesting, most unobvious thing on that journey. And there's a sense of play in that. There's a sense of creativity. So that's kind of one way of doing it, where you sort of challenge yourself to pay attention to the things around you that you would normally never, ever notice. There's a fantastic book called How to Be an Explorer of the World. In that book, the author, Kerry, it's a beautiful book, lots of illustrations, really fun. But the real premise around that is how to apply thinking like an artist, but also a scientist as well. So you've got the creative lens, but you've got the experimentation sort of data science lens as well, and actually combining those two things together. And what she talks about in that book is paying attention to the smallest of things that are in your everyday. And I think that's a really small but can be quite significant way in tapping into your creativity.
Well, it's it feels very spiritual as well. It's very much around the power of now and noticing and naming to really ensure that you're staying present during your day as well. It's a lovely kind of, I guess you've got two positives to come out of that exercise. It really draws your attention to what's going on in the world and just making you realize that we've got to be very present on this world and not to miss things and be rushing around all the time as well. And it's quite easy to forget to do that. So it's a really lovely exercise.
It's really powerful and very simple. And again, coming back to our relationship with technology and how we work and the behaviors that all of that has created, the sort of autopilot behaviors, actually challenging yourself to do something like that is great, because as you said, Fran, it takes you right into the present moment. And actually that is usually where we're not. We are either in the past or thinking about the future. We're really in the present.
Exactly.
So being able to do that really helps with creativity. Yeah.
Incredible. And are there any other little hints or tips that you've picked up?
Yeah. So for me, I love photography, and that's something that I've always loved right from teenage years. And so going out and exploring and taking photographs of things, for me, really helps to tap into my creativity. The patterns that you see in nature, the connections, the interconnectivity between everything, the cycles, just is utterly fascinating, because you see all of that in nature, but it's also in humanity as well, in terms of those patterns. But it manifests in very different ways. So being able to connect the dots around the world that we live in, and actually how that is reflective, not only in our environment, but also in us as human beings, I find utterly fascinating as well. So that they're probably my two favourite.
And getting out in nature is something that is so simple, and we can all do, and we can all see what's going on. It's just often we're too busy to have the time to kind of spend observing. We forget, we are in cycles, the seasons come and go, and that does have a profound effect on us as a human, and how we show up in the world and how we feel that day. It alters so much that we often don't tap into that enough, or be kind on ourselves enough to say, actually, it is cold today. I do actually just want to stay in, and
Yeah.
I'm happy to decline the invitation. I don't need to go out. I'm content with that. We are in the depths of winter, or, even whatever the season is, however you're feeling, it's okay for that to reflect your mood.
Definitely.
Because it does with nature. It does with how, how the plants show up to us. It does with how the animals show up to us. So we are no different. But like you mentioned earlier, technology often is filling that void now, where we can just think,
Massively.
we don't need to bother about what's going on outside.
It takes us away from ourselves. And I love technology, don't get me wrong. I spent 6 fantastic years working in that space, teaching people about technology, what it can do, and the brilliance that it can change organizations with. And I also see how it takes us away from ourselves. And that's something that I'm really passionate about, in terms of helping people, helping leaders to really tap into that. Who am I? That question. Who am I? What do I stand for? What's important to me? Get back to self, that core of who you are, the things that are most important to you, your values, your strengths, how you want to show up in the world, but also what's the impact that you want to create, and how are you going to do that? So that awareness piece and that identity piece is so powerful and so important. But it links to everything else. It really does. And the more that we can create that awareness, the more that we can understand who we are, how we show up in the world, the more that we can create that positive impact in our businesses and wider than that as well.
How have you seen your entrepreneurial workshop and mindsets and all your training that you're doing? Have you seen it pay off in these larger corporations where it's not coming as naturally to them, and you're in there teaching? Are you seeing this going down really well? Are people really receptive to want to get stuck into this side of themselves? Or is it met with tension and people are too busy and don't have time to engage?
When I share in the first module, the entrepreneurial mindset, when I share the attributes that I believe are the most relevant and reflective of an entrepreneurial mind, things like innovator, creative, agile, curious, making things happen, tenacious, all those wonderful things. Often people identify with at least one or more of those traits and start to then recognize, even if I didn't think that I was entrepreneurial, actually, I already have some of these things innate in me. And it's really just about recognizing those in yourself, and then seeing how you can use that lens to do different things within the workplace. So that first module I love so much, because it's almost like a penny drop moment, where if people are not feeling like they're very entrepreneurial at the beginning, actually they start to recognize, yes, I can see some of those traits already in myself, and then that creates the foundation and the platform to start to see how you can apply those attributes in different ways. And that, for me, is the fundamental part. It really is that identity piece. When we're able to relate, when we're able to connect with those things, and then redefine actually who we are. It's really powerful. And then I've gone on to see that people have done things that they wouldn't have necessarily done before, like reached out to former clients, and then, and if they're not in that role in an everyday basis, generated new business as a result of just experimenting with different things, being a bit more creative, being a bit more curious, and really owning that as part of their identity. So yeah, I love seeing the impact that part plays in terms of the entrepreneurial mindset, particularly with people who don't necessarily identify with being entrepreneurial. And it's the same with the creative question that you asked me earlier, Fran, around, do you see challenges with people identifying with creativity? Absolutely. And it's the same with entrepreneurial mindset, because often people think of the word entrepreneur and they think you can name very high profile, very successful business owners, global names, and they definitely don't identify with that and what they stand for. So what I'm saying is, this is about being who you are. This is not about changing anything about you. It's about tapping into the amazing parts of you and just, leveraging them or dialing them up to help tap into that creative entrepreneurial mindset. But it comes from who you are. It's always from that place of who you really are.
Have you ever felt companies be standoffish around this idea of giving employees this entrepreneurial mindset and opening their minds? Are they saying, Claire, are you being serious? You're going to teach them entrepreneurial mindset, and then before you know it, they're all going to find themselves and realise they don't want to be stuck in the corporate wheel, and they want to run for that door of freedom. And Claire, you are becoming the enabler. Have you felt that ever with anybody, or have you been always well received by companies and in this type of training?
The journey that I've gone on so far. So I launched this product in summertime this year, so in 2022, summertime 2022. And all of the organizations that I've spoken to and that I've run this with, it has been very, very relevant for their needs in terms of looking for new ways to grow business, looking for ways to apply that entrepreneurial mindset to manage people brilliantly, retain talent, create a fantastic environment for people to thrive and to grow their organization. So all of the organizations that I've been working with, absolutely that resonates. It's not going to be for everyone, and that's okay. There are lots of different products and services out there that are designed for specific audiences. And for me, it's really about being the right fit, and it's not going to be the right fit for everyone, and that's okay. So it's also where an organization is on their journey, and also what the business strategy is, what's important for them over the next 6 to 12 months, and if those aspects of growing business, getting people to think more creatively and innovatively around problem solving, managing people brilliantly, and wanting to build those capabilities with their managers and leaders, if those are part of what's going to help your business strategy, then it is relevant. But it's not going to be relevant for everyone, and that's okay.
How important is that personal piece around identity for all individuals to get under the skin of?
Identity is massive. It's who we are, and when things change and we lose our identity, whether that is becoming a parent, that there's a big shift when you become a parent around that. When you go from being an individual contributor into managing a team, the identity shifts because it's less about you. It's more about how you get the best out of the team. When you leave a industry, like I did in the first half of my career, when you need to redefine yourself, it's you're having to figure out who you are and what you stand for. And so that identity piece is massive, and it's challenging when so much of your identity is tied to what you do. And I've seen it in the work that I do and the clients that I coach in the career space. When people have been made redundant or they've left roles and they're sort of looking for and trying to explore and imagine what's next, that the identity bit is the bit that is the most challenging, because so much of the identity is tied to work. And so it really is about redefining, coming back into who you are. What do you stand for? What are your values? What are your strengths? What are your superpowers? What makes your heart sing in terms of what really interests you and what you are drawn to? All of these things give you guidance around your identity. But also, so much of it comes from awareness and paying attention to, what's connecting to you or not. But identity is massive. It's absolutely massive. So I was just going to say, it's also interesting to see the duality in terms of social media, because that's one aspect of identity in terms of this is how I want to portray myself. And then there is the other aspect of identity, which is this is how I am. And those two can be it's not always going to be shiny bright lights and amazing stuff. The reality is that life, as I mentioned earlier, is in cycles, and there will be times when things are really challenging. A curveball comes and sucker punches you in the gut, and you think, whoa, how am I going to deal with that? And it throws your life up in the air. But it's in those moments that you find out who you really are. Like, who am I in those moments of complete uncertainty, where you need to rebuild? And in that process, giving yourself the time and space to figure that out is really important. The key part around that is to be curious and to keep learning about yourself.
It's definitely an interesting time for so many people around the world right now, with the cost of living crisis affecting millions and millions of people in all countries. How important is it during these hard times to look for the creative part of ourselves? And should it still be important, or does that get pushed to the back seat for now?
Depends on what you're faced with. So if you're faced with thinking, how am I going to pay the bills? Actually getting creative in terms of all the different things that you might be able to do that could bring in money, using creativity around that, thinking laterally is going to be really helpful. Because in that, you are creating action and taking steps to move you forward. It's in the inaction that is where the fear starts to creep in. When we don't do anything and we just expect everything to happen around us, that's when we get scared. But actually, to face situations like that, which is always massively uncomfortable because it's uncertain and scary, use the creativity to explore, what could I do? What are all the possible ways I could solve this problem? The crazier, the better in many ways. And then prioritize what's going to get me the highest probability of success, and use that as the filter. How much effort do I need to put in? How much time is it going to take? What do I need to do? Assess it like that, so that you're able to look objectively and make an informed decision about what's going to be the best decisions that you can make moving forward. But I would absolutely say creativity is a great tool to have within your toolkit to help solve some of those problems, or think differently about solving the problem.
Often when I hear about people taking time to be creative or time to think and to plan, I often think to myself, how can they afford to have that time? It feels like time is a luxury, and how can you afford to have that time to do that? And does it warrant the time? Do we need to spend the time doing those aspects of life, when there appears to be so much doing involved rather than necessarily being in life? And it's under these challenging times, when whether or not it's personally at home or whether it's in the workplace, that we forget to tap into this part of ourselves, I think.
And when we're constantly doing, firefighting, being reactive to whatever is we're facing on a day-to-day basis, you're absolutely right. It's very hard to take a pause, and sometimes we can feel guilty for even taking a pause. But my question would be, what's the ultimate outcome that you want? If the ultimate outcome is to find new ways to make money, or think differently about solving a problem, then actually it is helpful to be able to create the space. Because when we're constantly doing, we're in beta brainwaves. When we give ourselves a small pocket of a window of time, then without always doing, then we move into alpha. And actually that's where alpha brainwaves, and that's when we become more creative. We can connect the dots, and often you'll find that when you're in the shower or when you go for a run, that's when the alpha brain waves are kind of kicking in, because you're not distracted by technology or your emails or other things, and that's where the brain automatically problem solves. The brain is working in the background to connect the dots between things and actually help us to be able to filter our environment to focus on the things that are important for us in terms of those goals or those important things that we need to focus on. So only in the alpha brainwaves, which is the space, the pause, can the brain work at that level to be able to connect the dots. So there is value in that, even if it's just 10 minutes, just to create a bit of space around that. I see it a lot in leaders who are all very incredibly busy, have a lot, high stakes decisions to make, and actually the brain and how the brain operates, we're constantly putting our brain under pressure in terms of the cognitive load that we expect our brain to operate at, and so to be able to give ourselves the space actually means that we can make better decisions when we've had more sleep, when we're on optimum brain health.
It's so true, and it really does ring true to me. I know when I haven't done my morning yoga, for instance, and it's day 3 of me just pushing it aside and thinking I just need to start work. And then I get to a point, a couple of hours in the morning, I'm feeling a bit blocked. My brain is not quite actually ticking over. And I think, you know what? I need to get back to doing my yoga. That's my time for me personally, when I can connect to myself, I can connect to the breath, I can really kind of, it's not think, but at the same time, just the thoughts that come through, I end up finding really valuable. They're really quality thoughts where I'm like, haha, that's the problem I've been trying to solve. Or I'm very good at getting stuck into work, but often I forget about personal life situations and birthdays. I'm terrible at remembering so many other things I should remember. And then it's in those moments it comes to me and I'm like, I do have a personal life. I must remember that all these things are happening and not get so distracted. And it's through those downtimes that my brain flicks into another mode and seems to remind me of all these other very important things.
Absolutely. And only in that space can it do that, because it's distracted by all these other urgent, important things that you're working on. Yeah. So if only we were to give ourselves a tiny bit more time and space, what amazing things our brain and imagination could connect the dots for us together. Einstein has a brilliant quote, which is, imagination is more important than knowledge. And I think that is such an interesting view of the world, because we are in a knowledge-based economy. There's knowledge everywhere. Anything you ever want to know, you can find the knowledge. And obviously that life was very different back when he was alive. It didn't have the internet at that point. But we do now. And so knowledge is everywhere. And so being able to give yourself that little pocket of space actually to tap into the imagination is key, because that's where the new ideas, the connecting of the dots happens. And but it requires a little bit of space to do that.
I love that. I love the idea that imagination could succeed knowledge, because it feels impossible. You know, there's a famous saying that everyone always talks about, especially, in the world of work, is knowledge is power. I just hear that all the time. Knowledge is power, knowledge is power, educate yourself. And yes, there is a point to that into some ways, but I don't hear anybody talking about imagination with the same gumption. And it's something that we often forget, isn't it?
It is. And if you look back over history from a leadership perspective, and I learned this through a neuroscience and leadership qualification that I did about 4 years ago with About My Brain, who are amazing. And they talk about, in the industrial era, in the industrial age of leading, it was all about the pyramid. Knowledge was held at the top. There was no feedback given. It was all about, you climbed that ladder, you became more powerful sort of in that pyramid. Then it moved into a knowledge-based style of leading, which is exactly to your point, Fran, around knowledge is power. And many organizations are still leading in that space in terms of the knowledge-based economy. We are moving into the imagination age, actually, where being able to harness your creativity, being able to harness your imagination has become more important, especially if you think what we've had to do since the pandemic, how the world shifted in like a heartbeat. We had to reimagine how we were going to do business without a rule book, without a playbook, without any kind of set of instructions to tell us what to do. We had to figure it out. And so the world is continuously changing and will continue to do so as a result of technology and also what we've been through with the pandemic. So being able to tap into imagination, being able to lead with creativity is becoming more and more important. And that's the shift from industrial to knowledge to imagination.
Oh, I love that. And I'm so happy to hear you say that too. I feel excited, especially, going into the next however many 10 years of, of our hopefully positive life, no more pandemics. We're done with that part now. We're ready to move into this new creative space. It's exciting, really exciting. And I love that you're teaching entrepreneurial mindset. I feel it's going to benefit everybody. As a small business owner myself, going into bigger companies for the last however many years, you quite often feel that they don't quite understand how smaller, agile, entrepreneurial-led businesses work because they are stuck into their corporate work. And actually, I feel like now the two are marrying much more succinctly. And we hear all the time we need to support small businesses, especially small companies selling products. My business, I sell a service. It's a bit different, but it's still similar mindsets of being a small entrepreneurial, very agile, opportunistic business and business owner. Yeah. And marry that with somebody who isn't like that or isn't portraying those signs. It can lead to difficult business. And sometimes you're like, this is so unfair. If only you understood the other side of the fence or, could empathize, we would all do much better in our work. You'd also be much better at your job and you'd be probably happier at home because, you realize there is so much to gain from an entrepreneurial mindset. And to look at situations as opportunistic opens your mind, it opens your soul, it opens your brain, it makes life a lot less scarier, that's for sure.
That's so true. And it's about bridging that gap, isn't it? In terms of, two very different contexts in terms of business, a different set of value systems, a different set of beliefs, a huge variance in culture in terms of leadership styles and behaviors. And often those two are polar opposites. And so you're often speaking a completely different language when you talk in this way. But so much of it is around having a collaborative conversation, recognizing those differences, but actually coming together through a collaborative conversation. There's a fantastic book that I've been reading recently, which is called Conversational Intelligence. And it is all about the different levels of how we communicate. And actually, the relationships that we build, and just sort of building on your point, Fran, around the differences within corporate and small businesses, when we're able to create great relationships, actually the relationship is the conversation. It's the conversation that we have. Yes, that is what is the relationship between the two. So when we're able to communicate at the highest level, which is collaborative communication, where we are shaping the future together, that is where the most powerful relationships, the greatest partnerships come together, where you're able to understand the differences between each other, but collaborate together to shape that future, the impact that you want to create together. But it comes from a collaborative conversation.
I absolutely agree. I think, and collaboration is key. And I hope that's coming into our next phase of life, Claire. Yes. I hope that's part of our imagination is power.
Definitely.
Brilliant. Love it.
Yes.
So Claire, we have one big question that we love to finish our episode on, and that is, what does becoming more human mean to you?
So first of all, I love that question. For me, what it means is first and foremost understanding yourself. Coming back to your identity point from earlier, who am I? What do I stand for? What's important to me? how do I want to show up in the world? And I think that is the first part around becoming more human. But it's also recognizing the relationship we have with technology, which can often take us away. As much as I love it, it can take us away from our humanity because it takes us outside of ourselves and distracts us. And so being more human for me is about that, in terms of knowing who you are. And then that part of you is the most authentic version of you. That knowing who you are taps into the authentic you. And when we are our most authentic version, that is the best version of us we will ever be. And also when we show up as ourselves, then we create the space as leaders to allow others to be themselves too. And that can only be a good thing.
I'm Francesca Donnellan, and you've been listening to Becoming More Human, the podcast. You can follow Becoming More Human on Instagram, subscribe, rate and review the podcast on your podcast apps such as Spotify, Apple, Amazon and Google. And don't forget to check out our website for exclusive audio content on becomingmorehuman.co.uk. Join me next week for another inspiring conversation. Thank you for listening.